That's why I asked you for using our technology. Oh, there. I couldn't find it. I didn't look down there. I kept looking on the wall.
Yeah, no, you're fine, because we're not, you're fine.
Yeah, so I'll do that. Yeah.
Try to make it easy on you guys.
Leah, you're not gonna go hear your husband speak?
Volleyball did well yesterday.
I have instructions not to.
Except our best players in the booth. Yeah.
Yeah, that is perfect, Matt.
Fraction.
Yep, that is perfect. So you're live streaming, when it's time, you're just gonna press that button right there.
So you know everybody,
Yeah.
everybody just got these problems.
That's, oh, no, it's orange. So just give it a second.
Yeah, so.
Okay, say something.
Now.
Yep.
Okay. Sounds in there. I'm gonna turn it off again.
Yeah.
That's been a sense of.
All right, you're perfect.
Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah. That's a good one. Be careful with my purse here.
Oh, that's okay.
I would sit up there, I'm just afraid I'll fall down.
Oh,
Yeah, I can just see it. Boom.
so you know I did.
Yeah.
Matt, where did you grow up?
No, I was passing it.
Louisiana.
Did you? Okay,
Also Baton Rouge.
okay. I was looking at, I'm gonna introduce you, so I was looking at
Of course, because that's a big stretch.
profile page at the college, and I saw that you,
I'm gonna be
your
out of
undergraduate degree was from Louisiana, so I assumed that you were probably from.
My dad was a county extension agent, so I was always connected to the university from the time I could remember.
Did he go
Even
to
though
Auburn?
obviously not the academic.
Yeah. But still.
Oh, better than that, LSU.
Oh, sorry. Well,
But I was at, this won't get many points either, but I was at University Presbyterian in Tuscaloosa.
I know that. Is that church still kicking?
It is, they combined with Grace, which was out on Hargrove Road. And there was only a mile and a half between them. But the university started doing some development in that area and shifted.
So they left that facility there.
It was a nice little,
I thought so too.
beautiful.
Wonderfully located too.
I was fortunate though. I mean, every place I got to work,
Good morning. Good
I
morning.
get a little bit of freedom to say what I want to. University of Baton Rouge, there. I ended up preaching a fair amount at First Presbyterian in Albany.
Oh, really?
You can imagine somebody with this accent preaching up there.
I bet they loved it.
But they really warmed up after a while. And I had 3 really good congregational experiences.
You know, I believe I was once upon a time in the first Presbyterian in Albany because my roommate got married there. In Albany, New York.
Yep.
Yeah, that's where everyone got married. That's right.
Was that John, your roommate got married in Albany, New York?
That's right. I went up to do best friend.
That was kind of fun because that's where I think it was Elihu Knott preached the famous sermon against dueling
Oh,
because Hamilton and Byrd both had some kind of connection with Congress. I don't know if I've ever read the sermon actually.
and that was the beginning of the American Anti-Dueling Society.
So those are kind of little fun things. That sanctuary is just fabulous. It was like a 50 windows.
She was older, but she was great. The way she done it.
Good for you, because you were.
Yeah, but anyway.
She good.
You don't do that in Japan, but I do. Oh, we signed. We did some transportation. The Browns room, I believe, yes, for the day of the sun.
Bobby is in, remember Bobby?
Yes, she was in.
Well, she's just had a lot of physical problems, and her memory has sort of gone. I mean, she probably knows you, and she knows me, certainly, but she's having her memory short, kind of bad.
I know you're gonna do it with college, you know.
They
were,
Man, I'm kind of, was it good ears that you started?
Yep.
Like,
Week and a half ago, in
And then
some kind of weird cosmic thing, the same day Fernando Valenzuela, they died on the same day.
She has that wonderful positive attitude.
John, you got a haircut.
Would tell us
I did.
stories all the time.
I did.
She just laughs.
We're gonna wait a couple more minutes.
That clock is really long.
Oh, it is.
Yeah, at least it's so far off, you know, it's exactly. You had some family yeah, I didn't text her or email, but I.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, she had beautiful.
That was a good memory. It was lovely place. Yeah.
How are you?
How about yourself?
Miss it.
I got one on the other side, so I'm good. Good morning, Barbara. How are you doing? Good.
It is.
And it's cost.
Yeah, you know, I don't know.
We missed it. So. Michigan. Going up to Michigan. We have a wedding this winter. We used to live there. Yeah. So we have a wedding and then.
We are gonna go ahead and get started. My pleasure to introduce not a stranger to the church, the Reverend Dr. Matt Samson. Matt and his lovely wife Nancy's in the back row. Regularly attend Jubilee, so we've stolen away for a day. Matt is professor of anthropology and chair of the Latin American Studies program. Is it program? Department at Davidson College. He is a socio-cultural anthropologist that particularly is interested in indigenous culture and religious changes in Latin America, particularly among the Maya and Guatemala, where he's done the majority of his research. Matt, thank you for being here. It is our pleasure to have you, and we will hear what you have to say to us.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
You, John. Okay, let's begin with a prayer for the day. Let us pray. Greater God, you filled the world with beauty. Open our eyes to behold your gracious hand in all your works, the rejoicing in the whole creation. we may learn to serve you with gladness for the sake of the one by whom all things were made, Jesus Christ, our Redeemer, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. So I'm going to kind of romp through some ideas about Latin American political theology and the common good. Some of them are a little bit, I'm not sure if they're half-baked, but they're not fully thought out and put on the page. And I'm going to kind of stick to a text for a few minutes here, and then I'm going to show about 3 slides in that context. I'm probably going to turn that off and then move into some issues that I think are relevant to the contemporary moment. But what I want to do is, because a lot of Latin American theology, at least as I was exposed to it, as early as going to Montreat when I was about 14, 15 years old, and people were beginning to fight over liberation theology, and until the present day has been contextual. So that word comes up a lot. So we don't do theology in a vacuum. I'll just put it that way for the moment. It always has to relate to the context in which we find ourselves. It doesn't mean that we don't separate theological reflection sometimes on different levels, but ultimately our task is to address how we perceive God to be working in the kind of world that we live in. So what I want to do is, some of you may have seen some of this before, but I want to situate what I'm going to say this morning in kind of a demographic approach to what some of us call world Christianity or the world Christian movement. And this particular chart is now about 12, 13 years old, but it's hard to find concise information. And I think it's big enough that you can actually make some sense out of it. So the first World Missionary Conference was held in 1910 in Jerusalem. So that becomes kind of a watershed moment for Protestants, at least, to begin looking at missionary activity that had largely started throughout the 19th century. And we can certainly trace Catholic missionary activity and movement of church groups throughout what we call the colonial period in this hemisphere. But if you go back to the 1500s, even before, there's a lot of Catholic missionary activity in what we sometimes refer to as the East. So I don't want to kind of lose sight of that. But in 1910, there were in 2010, so we're looking from 1910 to 2010. In 1910, there were 2.8 billion Christians in the world. And that's about a third of the global population. It's the largest of the so-called world religions with Islam behind it. My numbers are probably a little bit old, but about 1.8 billion people in the world are Muslim. So that gives us a different framework. What I'm concerned with is the global percentage of Christians in Europe and Americas. And in absolute numbers, they have dropped from 93% in 1910 to 63% of the global population. We have dropped, if you want to put it that way. Okay. 63%. In another perspective, what I think we want to focus on is that 61% of the world's Christians live in the global South as opposed to the global North. Now, those frameworks we always have to analyze a little bit, but basically the global North is considered to be Europe. Actually, I'm not totally sure where Russia falls in that because they're a huge country in that regard, and places like Australia and New Zealand. And then the global South, obviously China and India are in the northern hemisphere in that regard, okay? But we consider them because when we were looking at development issues in the 60s and 70s, you remember the term third world, okay? And now we talk about the global South. Some people want to problematize all this. But the point is that at this juncture, 61% of the world's Christians live in the global south. What this means is that the so-called center of gravity of Christianity is shifted. The point from which we do theology and create theology is not necessarily any longer situated in Europe and North America, although the United States is still, in absolute numbers, the largest Christian country by some measure. Okay, so the issue becomes, how do we hear voices from the other part of the world? So what you have here, you can see in 1910, Europe had 66.3% of the Christians. The Americas, that includes both North and South America, in that kind of hemispheric framework, has 27%. Now the Americas, because you have United States, Mexico has 1/3 of our population, Brazil has 2/3 of our population. The Americas still has a plurality, almost 37%. But you can see how much Europe has decreased, and then look at the rise of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, and Asia and the Pacific in terms of Christian population 100 years later. Okay, so that's what I really want to focus on. Now, these demographics track with other kinds of movements within the Christian movement itself. And one of those is that the fastest growing part of Christianity, where it grows, tends to be some form of what scholars have called renewalist. For our purposes, maybe we can call it Pentecostalized religion. Those kind of folks that Presbyterians don't know what to do with, because the frozen chosen don't really have much acquaintance with the Spirit most of the time. Okay, now, they have their own theologies, and some of them are quite interesting. I'm not really going to touch on that today, but it's important to have that in mind. Partly because we simply can't write them off if we're going to take Christianity and Christian movement seriously in the contemporary world. Okay. So in Latin America, the other part that you want to have in mind, I'm not really going to address this either, is that in about 1960, 90%, maybe even more than that, of the population was considered to be Catholic. Today, the number hovers around 20, maybe a little bit more percent is some form of Protestant. Now, I don't talk about Protestantism in Latin America. I talk about Protestantisms. There's more than one. That's why I bring up this Pentecostal piece in part. It's probably true in our context too, but we usually try to figure out who the evangelicals are among the Protestants, and then we have to figure out who the fundamentalists are among the real fundamentalists, but that's an issue for another day. All right. So the other part of this is, and this will come up again, I hope at the end of this, is that there has been an increase in religions associated with people's identity. So gender comes up very quickly. Various kinds of feminist anthropology, theologies, African descent religions get more and more attention. Where I work in Guatemala, what I'm concerned mostly with is indigenous spirituality and how that relates to who we are as Christians, and how all these movements, feminism, indigeneity, recognition of African descent populations, not only in the history of our relationship with those populations, not only a place like Davidson, but also in those spaces where we're trying to do theology. How do we include those in the context of our broader reflection? Okay, so we'll get back to this a little bit, but let me show you just a couple other slides really quickly, because I already mentioned this. But these are 10 countries with the largest number of Christians. So that list might be a little bit surprising to you. Brazil, Mexico right after the United States. Okay. Russia is way up there, as I said. People forget about the Philippines. Okay. Indonesia, by the way, is the largest Muslim country in the world if we're thinking about the islands. So it might help us to kind of decenter ourselves a little bit there. China might surprise you a little bit. on this list. But Germany's still fairly high in this regard. Okay. So I just want to show you where some of the shift has taken place. So the question for today is, even though we're going to move into Latin America, more broadly then, how are we supposed to take these changes into account? Is in very general terms what I want to talk about. In the academy, we talk a lot about positionality these days. How are we situated when we reflect on the world around us? And then how does that positionality contribute to the way in which we reflect and the content of our reflection? Okay. So these days, when we think globally, we might want to think about issues such as migration and climate change as two representative examples that our theology needs to address. And there are many others. Okay. But the issue again is how to consider the concerns of voices from the global South, of which Latin America is a part for this presentation, and take into account some of the reordering of human populations and the alignment of populations in different places. So 2 years ago, I was in El Salvador, 2.5 now, when Russia invaded Ukraine. And I was working with a very, very small Reformed denomination here. And it was pretty clear to me that this was egregious and something that I needed to be concerned about from where I sat. But this person from El Salvador told me, said, well, I think they just need to negotiate. And then he said, I've been worried about NATO for a long time and the way in which they reacted when the wall fell down in Russia. So for 2.5 years, as I continue to operate in the space that I inhabit here, and the concern that we have, particularly in Davidson, we've had a number of events in support of Ukraine, that sort of thing. This has continued to gnaw at me a little bit because I'm hearing a voice from somebody in another context that's not seeing the world the way I'm seeing. And just this past week, maybe some of you saw it, and I know I may be beating this to death, but I think it's really important. There was an article by Lydia Polgreen in the New York Times, 29th of October, just 4 days ago, really, 5 maybe, okay. And it was called, We've Just Had a Glimpse of the World to Come. And the world to come in that case was the summit that Putin had with the so-called BRICS nation. Now the S is on it. Okay. We don't need to go into this. It might dovetail slightly with what Dr. Jaw presented last week. But originally it was Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then South Africa got brought into this. So according to the article that I was reading, Putin was saying, well, if we want to think about economics and global economic realignment, this group represents more people than the Western economies. Okay. Now, maybe we're not going to cash in our passports. Maybe after Tuesday, some of us will. Okay. But this raises a whole series of issues, and I'm going to read it the way she stated it. And it will show you how radically different some people perceive the world when they're not positioned where we are. Now, I think some of our identity politics here would resonate with this, but I'm not going to get in that today. Polgreen said, but Putin is tapping into a very real set of resentments that I've been hearing because we can think that he's just taking advantage of a situation I don't like him, I'll just say that anyway. But he's tapping into a very real set of resentments I've been hearing with increasing anger and frustration from leaders, scholars, and ordinary people across the global South. So I'm hearing this guy in El Salvador when I'm reading this. They hear from the global North a clear set of messages directed at the poor world. Do not cross our borders. trade on our terms, forget globalization. We're going to focus on building at home, help shoulder the burden of reducing emissions, and don't expect much assistance dealing with climate change, despite the fact that we have historically caused almost all the damage. Stand with us on the sovereignty of Ukraine in condemning Russian indifference to civilian casualties. Listen to our lectures about human rights, democracy, and international law, but do not question our support for Israel's blood-soaked war in Gaza. So these are the litanies of things that they hear us saying, but when you're positioned somewhere else, you might look at the world quite differently. And if I got anything else to say today that might be important, that's probably going to pale in light of this set of questions. But if theology is contextual, or as I put in the title of this, if we're concerned about the common good, and we don't always follow lectionary, but the lectionary for today is Ruth telling Naomi, your people will be my people, and I'm going with you. In the gospel, it's a commandment to love God and to love your neighbor. So when we think about our common home, we can't ignore the fact that people see us this way, is what I want to argue here. So the concern is that the presentation of a world order, a different one, by the so-called BRICS nations challenges the colonial imperialist history of the West and the structure of the global economic and political order that perpetuates inequalities while we continue on with life as usual. And I can't help but look at myself in the mirror every time Saturday rolls around. I enjoy fall football because I do. Even though it's probably a bad sport at this juncture. So these are the theological issues that I think bear scrutiny from any part of the world. Although the focus here is on Latin America, so I'm going to turn to that briefly. You have a handout. I'm not going through that handout. I made that a long time ago for students, but I'm going to hit some of the same points on that piece of paper that I put there. And to do this, I want to highlight one more thing, and I'm probably going to turn this off. The so-called father of liberation theology, Gustavo Gutierrez, died just a week ago. Hopefully, I can pull that back up. Okay. And he wrote a book called A Theology of Liberation. It was published in English in 1973, and it was published in Spanish in 1971. So he wrote the seminal work on that. But there was a Brazilian Presbyterian named Ruben Alves who, about 69, also published a book called A Theology of Hope. So it's much more complicated. Gutierrez obviously is dealing with Catholic social teaching and some other issues in his work. Okay, and even before that, the educator Paulo Freire wrote this book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed that ended up helping us think about how we relate to education systems and what they perpetuate and how we see people in the context of education. Are we learning subjects? We always think of subjects, in lab coat and we're studying, but are we subjects or agents of our own history? Or are we objects where people, as my teachers used to say, wanted to pour knowledge in my head? Did y'all ever hear that when you were little? I could drill a hole and pour knowledge in here and you'd be just fine. Well, that's treating students as an object. And Freire proposed that we have problem-posing types of education for shorthand. So I just want to kind of introduce those for a minute. And then, as usual, let's see if this works. If it doesn't, we're not going to. This is about a 2-minute description of liberation theology by a guy who actually comes out of a more evangelical tradition, but I thought it was helpful if it works. I tested it, but it doesn't always. and it sometimes takes a minute. Now I have to multitask. All right, let's see if this works. Our sound may not help us in this. Okay. Well, I'm gonna bail out of this. It's a really kind of interesting couple of statements that he makes here about what liberation theology is. He claims it's dead. I don't think it's dead. I think it's getting restructured and people are continuing to build on it, is what I think is really happening. Okay. All right. And you can kind of look at some of the things on the sheet here. Luis Rivera Pagan, who is emeritus professor of economics at Princeton, I'm not sure exactly where he is now, summarized kind of 5 points in liberation theology. I'm just going to kind of make brief comments about these. And again, they're not on there, but you can see how they might track with some of the central tenets. One is what he calls the retrieval of subversive memories inscribed in sacred scriptures, which are hidden below layers of cultic regulations. So if you think of Leviticus, you got all those laws and everything, but what the laws are talking about end up being Jubilee. Okay, how do we recover memories behind these other texts? Okay, layers of cultic, but hidden below layers of cultic regulations and doctrinal orthodoxies, but never totally effaced. In other words, how you read the scripture a little bit subversively. What are you going to recover in there? Why does Ruth decide to go back to Naomi's people? That might be a good question there in this context. A historical understanding of Jesus's proclamation of God's kingdom. The kingdom is conceived as referring not to some otherworldly post-mortem realm, but rather to the unceasing hope of a social configuration characterized by justice, solidarity, and freedom. 3, the divine preferential option for the poor, the excluded, and the destitute of this world. The church must become the church of the poor by sharing the poor's sorrows, hopes, and struggles. Initially, the emphasis of the preferential option was socioeconomic, but it was gradually widened to include other categories of social exclusion. Indigenous communities, racial and ethnic minorities, women, and sexual orientation. That's how we broaden this out when we're thinking about our common home. 4, theology cannot be reduced to an intellectual understanding of faith. It must also be a practical commitment for historical transformation. And transformation is a word I hear more and more when I'm delving into, because I don't do it systematically, theology in the global south. 5, God is conceived not as an immutable and impassible intellectual, something that we think about, but in line with the biblical narratives as a compassionate, eternal spirit who hears and pays close attention to the cry of the oppressed and whose action in human history has the redemption of the downtrodden and excluded as its ultimate telos. Okay. So that's where you can hear throughout all this is this preferential option for the poor. And Gutierrez, I found a volume, I didn't have much time to look into it, called Decolonizing Liberation Theology. And one of the articles written by a woman theologian from Brazil, again, quoted the very last line of Gutierrez's A Theology of Liberation. In the final instance, we don't have an authentic theology of liberation until the oppressed themselves can freely lift their voices and directly and creatively express themselves in society and in the heart of the people of God. It's kind of an interesting word in Spanish, seno, which actually often is related to the idea of breast, but usually gets translated as in the midst of, but I kind of like the idea of heart, in the heart, the center of people of God. But it's kind of fun to play around with that a little bit because I think you can get a lot of mileage out of that one word that's in the final sentence of the book there. Okay. So I got a little bit more time, but less to talk about perhaps. So what I want to mention what I mentioned before, the idea of feminist eco-theology. So people in Latin America have been looking at environmental issues strongly for at least 30 years as we begin to critique development and agendas of modernity. That means that everybody's going to get integrated into the world order in the way that we are in the West. Okay, that raising living standards seems to be fine, but at what cost? And who's paying the price for that? Again, remember who creates much of the impetus for climate change and refuses to engage it on lots of levels. We can't even talk about it in a national election. That's damning because it may be the issue, I think it is the issue of the day. And it exacerbates inequality. People are forced to migrate. And if you live in Western North Carolina, you might also want to see how it can approach your own back door. So you even get some literature. I didn't look at this, so I'm just going to throw it out there for fun. There's even one article called that refers to the ecopolis. So if you think in election systems, political system, the polis is the city, place that we inhabit. What would an ecopolis look like? And what does a gendered perspective have to do with looking at issues like that? Okay. So I'm going to leave that one because I'm out of my depth at this juncture because I haven't had a chance to really look into it. I do a bit more. I didn't bring any quotes. I'm just going to introduce you to the idea, an idea from Latin American indigenous theology. They wouldn't call it theology. They would talk about practices. They might talk about spirituality, but that's because they're getting language probably from us. It's really difficult to figure out how to position this kind of thinking. So we end up talking about epistemology, ways of knowing. How do we know what we know? Are we only rational? I think, therefore I am. What if we experience reality in a different way because of who we are? Is one way I like to get into this. So the concept that they are latching onto now, and as I begin to look at decolonizing liberation theologies, this is even becoming more and more complex because we appropriate these terms in our context. Okay, and I teach at Davidson College, so it's going to be an intellectual context. The kind of theology I do as a Presbyterian is based in intellectual reflection. Okay, and and maybe it's important, it is on that sheet, to remember how Gutierrez defined liberation theology. His is the succinct one. Critical reflection on praxis in light of the Word of God. I think he actually just stopped with Word. I was looking at it one day. But of the Word. Okay. Praxis simply means practical experience, what we are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. But the word cannot be separated from praxis, from where we find ourselves. Again, that contextual notion that starts with this kind of theology. Buen vivir is variously translated as good living. I like to think of it more as living well, because it's not the same thing as having 2 houses and a boat somewhere or something like that. But it can be translated in various ways. And there are 2 languages, both from South America, Quechua and Aymara. Quechua was actually the language of the so-called Incan Empire. Okay. And they have a couple of words that they use for this. I'm going to just write them up here for fun. Suma Camana is Aymara, and in Quechua it's Suma Jose. All right. Now, first of all, we're having to make a transition even to put it in Spanish and then bring it into English. Okay. These words can't be taken to mean exactly what we think they mean once we do translation twice removed at this point. Now, I don't usually get hung up on this when I'm teaching about this in the classroom. The idea is it's a fundamental question about what it means to live well, and one that we need to take into account. You will also hear references coming out of this context to Pachamama. Okay, and who is Pachamama? Pachamama is Mother Earth. Okay, so and you have to tell people all the time, we only got those pictures of Earthrise from the moon where you could see the Earth coming up over the horizon of the moon. We didn't get that picture until '68. The so-called blue marble is a little bit later in the early '70s. We haven't seen ourselves as a part of a larger creation or a larger cosmos, most of us in the Western world, until we begin to reflect on those pictures. Students that are here are going to only be in the 2nd or 3rd generation of real environmentalists. And what have they been willed? So in this context, I'm going to read this. I can explain it, but I think I'd rather, this is a fairly good definition. So, and I'm just going to skip around. I'm going to cut it. While its meaning is not free of dispute, a preliminary definition can be spelled out. Living a full life in the sense of being in a state of permanent respect and harmony, not only with other individuals and society as a whole, but also with the cycles of nature. But it's important to highlight that Quechua and Aymara cosmovisions do not make any separation or distinction between the individual, society, and nature. We're a part of everything, and other species therefore have value. Maybe even equal to our own. Furthermore, the mere idea of an independent individual is completely unheard of for these doctrines. They wouldn't call them doctrines, but this kind of epistemology. Our rampant way of perceiving of ourselves as individual, and I'm trying to get known for this, so when I walk out of here, the only thing that I remember I said was, you're not a self-made individual. Nobody is a self-made individual. Now, I don't know where I got that from. Maybe I got it from interacting with some folks in Latin America. But I think it's really important in addressing these kind of epistemologies to have that on the table. Okay. In the style of holistic conceptions, different human beings are integrated into the vital cycles of Pachamama. Therefore, Buen Vivir assumes, well, I'm not even going to read that one. One could argue that Buen Vivir means living a fulfilling life because it involves living according to the rules of nature that serve as guides for human action. So this is what I think one way in which theology from Latin America pushes us toward thinking about a common home and the common good. Okay, and Pope Francis's encyclical on climate was a really important statement in this regard. He talked about, I think it was a cosmic ecology. So no, it's not. It's your integral ecology. Thank you. I knew I'd get some help there. I stole the other term from somebody else. Okay. All right. So this is what we're dealing with. So I want to return just to liberation theology and then open up to some questions for a minute. I got a couple of, I kept looking and looking. And I think we can find some feminist stuff written by Reformed theologians in a number of spaces in Latin America. I know that the organization that brings together Reformed groups has a number of active theologians, but they're in different spaces where theological education is fairly strong or where networks have formed maybe to respond to social issues and stuff like this. So I looked in their book and in their most recent publication from May, and it's the Association of Reformed Churches. They have is a very thin publication, but they're trying, I think, to put some issues out there. So the articles in there were about women and they were about youth. Big focus on youth. And I think it's also important to note that in some places in Latin America, youth doesn't mean teenagers with raging hormones and stuff like that. They actually include youth from maybe as young as 12 up to 30. I've even been in places in Cuba years ago where people who were in their early 30s were still considered youth. Very another kind of different notion that I get from a long time going to these places. But I don't know if I can find it. I did in this particular edition of that organization's information, there was a poem. And I don't know, it's going to turn us back to human beings, but I think with the election coming up and some other issues, it's important, but it's also something I really like because when I teach about the anthropology of religion, I very quickly find myself going to the idea of the holy and what it means to be set apart for something. And my favorite one, of course, is when Moses is wandering around, this bush starts talking. Now I'm getting the hell out of there. When that bush starts talking to me, I'm not hanging around the eco preserve back there. Okay, but what does the bush say? Moses, Moses, take the shoes off your feet, for this place is sacred land. Yes, barefoot, like that leper who appeared in the road, apart from the world, forgotten by this world, and whom Jesus, your son, healed. Yes, barefoot like the paralytic who arrived by being let down through the roof for an encounter with the teacher, and who was saved by the faith of his friends. Yes, barefoot like those humble and indebted fishers, children of no one, owners of nothing, squashed by Rome, who were chosen to announce the greatest message of love ever seen. Barefoot like that woman at the well to whom Jesus spoke of living water, who Jesus sent to proclaim this living water. Yes, barefoot, because these men, these women, the humble, the infirm, those without land, the alms seekers, those without voice, these, the barefoot ones, are the chosen ones of God.
As we consider questions, Matt, would you repeat the question because they can't hear it on Zoom, wherever Zoom is somewhere?
Well, this isn't a question.
Missy first, and I'll go over here.
This isn't a question, but I had that bingo moment, which I really appreciate when you talked about the person in Guatemala who was not into the way the world is going right now, and just sort of focused my mind on that. And I really appreciate that experience.
It haunts me
Yes.
2.5 years later, because it's not what we hear.
That's right.
So the issue is that the idea that somebody else has a different perspective about how the world's put together is meaningful.
I lived in Brazil for 2 years back in the days of the Peace Corps, 66 through 68. And I came to feel that the United States really would protect capitalism at any cost. At any cost. And it was during a time when the president of Chile, I believe, was overthrown by the CIA. Allende, yeah. And, you know, in a similar time, and they felt like he was too socialist. They overthrew the elected president of Iran because he seemed to side too much with the Russians and was too socialist. Fidel Castro was a popular revolutionary. Nicaragua, they sided with the large landowners rather than someone who wanted to redistribute property. I was in Brazil probably 20 years ago, and this time I'd been in the northern part, northeastern part, which is the Sertão. It's a dry, poor area. But then I had a chance to go down on a trip near Sao Paulo and ride west for nearly a day on a bus. And you know, we talk about who owns the land and who can live on the land. We drove on that bus for a day and a half, and there were fields that were on relatively flat ground. There was not a house to be seen, not a house or a town hardly. It was just planted in soybeans or corn or some kind of grain. Corporations own so much and would not allow any towns or people to be living in that area. I mean, other than tractors, they were wider than anything I've ever seen here. And I thought, you know, we're really pressed to have capitalism exist and fight it when somebody seems to be intent on redistributing the wealth.
I think that's an important point. The short version of all that was that from experience in Brazil in the 60s, that it looked like a lot of U.S. policy was geared toward simply promoting a capitalist system. And the way in which, even in places like Brazil, development has taken place, you end up with large corporations destroying a lot of land or planting monocultures in soybeans or other kinds of grains. And those are some of the same issues that we can look at in our own context. You did mention Allende in 73. We'll point that out because in Latin America, they talk about the overthrow of Salvador Allende in Chile as being Latin America's September the 11th. Because he was overthrown on September the 11th in 1993, and that led in 1973, and that led to a lot of repression in Chile. So in our focus on security after September the 11th, we might consider other people who are concerned about their own security in the face of actions perpetuated by our own government.
I wonder if you could say some more about Buen Vivir and living well. And I think there is a fundamental question in ethics and in religion there. I mean, what is a good life? What is living well? You can see it in Thomas Aquinas. You can see it all the way through. One question I have is, what do you think that looks like in American culture today? What are the models? I mean, I can think of one. There's a sort of commercial model where living well means you acquire a lot of stuff and you make a bunch of choices. I think another one is a therapeutic model. You feel good about yourself, but notice the reference to self, which is big time. And if you try and work a politics in relationship to those answers to the question of what living well is, it comes out differently than if you have different answers to that question. And so I just wonder about that.
I think that's the big question. When I talk about a clash of epistemologies, it's fundamentally about how we understand the world. Do we understand it from a consumer capitalist standpoint? Do we understand it from a therapeutic standpoint? I really think that, related to the point I was just trying to make, and it's certainly true in immigration. I don't even call it debate. I just call it a bunch of lies and misrepresentation. That if you go walk around town, you're going to see all these signs that say Trump secure borders, Kamala open borders. We haven't had open borders since the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. We might as well start there. But in relation to secure borders, and this does play into both a consumeristic and a therapeutic model, the idea of security and safety end up becoming what in the Reformed tradition we might call an idol. They shape how we look at the world. They shape our political life, our discourse, and our discourse ends up being our life in lots of ways. So I think, Doug, I don't have a really good answer to that question. I think the question is how we're going to unpack it, and in particular situations, how we're going to try to enact this. Native American groups are going to have one way of doing it. And since this is indigenous theology in Latin America, we need to pay attention to that.
Well, what my guess is also when Pope Francis starts talking about an integral ecology that has to do with relations with non-human things and also justice within human communities as one big thing, that's really pretty different than simply a therapeutic or a commercial understanding of good life. And so he's trying to push something else, right? And I think that you're right. I mean, that what he's trying to talk about can be related in some ways to some of these other conceptions. It'd be interesting.
In another term we deal with in environmental stuff.
Repeat that. Can you try to repeat?
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Sorry.
The point is that I'm being agreed with for the most part there, but what we want to do is then look beyond some of the issues and the way in which we think about them and address them in specific places and contexts. And I was going to say, I think another issue, because the original question was, where do you see Buen Vivir in, what does it look like in our context? And we had already gotten a couple of kind of critiques of that, one from the capitalist perspective and then from a therapeutic perspective focused on the self. But in environmental work these days, we also talk a lot about intergenerational justice. So if you think of interspecies justice, if you will, if we're not separate from the natural world, but are part of it, what would intergenerational justice? It's not just about what we leave our children or our grandchildren. It's about what kind of place we leave our children and our grandchildren. And it's going to be a lot less healthy place if the environment's not healthy. And I do think we run into, there are different kind of communal movements and different kinds of movements that try to construct the church in different ways in certain places. They called it for a while the new monastery movement or something, where people are moving in the urban areas. Those aren't new. I mean, we've had a lot of that since the social gospel started. So I think these are points of convergence or conversation. Saw another hand somewhere. Yeah.
So, depending on where you're from, this is what I hear. That's going to, of course, affect your worldview, how you view life. If you're from the United States, you're going to view our policies in a different way than someone from, say, Russia or China or something like that, and vice versa, I'm sure. So what would be, it seems to me then that the thing would be, is it possible for people to try to, I'm not suggesting that everybody says everything's okay, but what would help people to get another view, besides their own view, or to be open to it, or something like that?
So the question is, how can we be open to other perspectives? And where do we get resources to develop these other perspectives? Because I'm giving this talk in a church, the first thing we need to do is go back to the text and see what the text, I would argue the tradition too, because it's not just the Bible. We don't make the Bible an idol. That text and our theological texts are in dialogue with all kinds of things going on. But we have to include some of these other perspectives in the way in which we reflect on this. That, I think, for me, that's where I start, but I also think it has something to do with our liturgical life. There's a reason why we have prayers of confession. It gets debated all the time. There's a reason why that's there. Because we don't live in a perfect world. And we are in part responsible. Remember, it's a corporate confession. It's not every little thing you did wrong this week. When you raised your voice in the wrong place, or you cursed out that person that cut you off in traffic or whatever. We can go down that list. So I think that's where I start in this context, Pam, but I think that we have to put ourselves in a situation to listen. And I think that's a really hard thing to do in the kind of society that we live in. How do we actually hear what other people are saying? We used to say you couldn't, until you walk a mile in somebody else's shoes, you know what they're going. That may not be a bad place to start, since we're talking about barefoot people a while ago. But what does it mean to be barefoot? But then we have to ask fundamental questions about the kind of society we want to live in. How many children in this country don't have health care? 2 years ago, we have been giving people handouts. Oh, and child poverty decreased. So what are we going to do? We're just going to go back to a world where child poverty is on the rise again and we don't care? And how do you call out lies in the political arena? For example. There's also a difference between a lie and a fib, but we don't need to get into that. All right. So That's not much of an answer, but
No, that's good. I also wonder how someone from another, I know that, you know, you've given an example of how this one person from another culture views our culture. But how would, and they must, in their own way, I'm not trying to say we're A-okay, because we certainly are not. We're very wealthy and responsible for many things. But their views must have certain distortions in them too. I mean, it would be just impossible for them not to, you know, like, because you're gonna know what you know what you do.
so yes, how then do we look at other cultures? No, we should not romanticize or exoticize, as we say in anthropology. I mean, part of the reason why we have this, or especially liberation theology, is because you had a situation where you had incredible poverty, you had military dictatorships. But we also talk about reading the signs of the times. Juan Luis Segundo has a good quote about that. I can't do it off the top of my head. But that what we do is we try to read the signs of our times and then make sense out of them. But that means we're going to act. So on that note, I guess
Thank you so much, Dr. Matt Samson, for opening our eyes to the different ways of seeing the world, to liberation theology. Thank you for ending with the Moses story. Take off your shoes, you're on holy ground. Thank you. And Leah, you had a question, I could tell. Sorry.
did I miss you?
I just wanted to say that, first time I heard of liberation theology was in 1989. I had just started a job at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. It's a Jesuit university. Director of Media Relations. First day on the job, I started getting calls from the Los Angeles Times and a slew of other media. 6 Jesuits had been murdered in El Salvador and their housekeeper. And this was a Jesuit university, so they knew each other, a lot of the priests there. And so then it went from that to everybody asking about liberation theology, because that was all interwoven into that whole thing. And former President Reagan was scheduled to be at the campus a few days later. And we got word that the Central American Refugee Center would come to our campus en masse to protest because they felt like his policies were responsible for those murders in El Salvador. So when you talk about liberation theology, it brought all that back today at that time.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because those are really important issues in those days. We put $5 billion in El Salvador.
Yeah.
And I'll just add one thing. I really want to end on your words, but remember that whole decade was bracketed by Romero getting killed, Archbishop Romero in 80, and then this happened in 89. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.